Well, good evening again, everyone. Around our subject of food and fellowship, I thought maybe John Aldersley was going to steal my thunder this morning when he spoke about the tithe which Abram offered. I wanted to revisit that this evening. The first occasion that bread and wine are referred to together is at Genesis 14 verse 18, and they are associated with godly fellowship. On that occasion, as you recall, a prince of peace and righteousness who was a high priest of the Most High God brought out bread and wine from a city named Salem, which significantly means peace. And this royal priest set forth a meal at which both God and man would be blessed. The king priest who initiated and hosted this fellowship meal was Melchizedek, of course, who had come to greet the Hebrew patriarch Abram, or as we now know him, Abraham. This being the first mention of shared food and drink since Eden, the story forms a model or prototype of fellowship meals through the biblical era and on into the future age of the prophesied messianic banquet. With such God-centered diners as Melchizedek and Abram, it was obviously a reverent occasion, certainly, but equally it was an hospitable, celebratory and convivial occasion. Now, the background to this meal was a military raid on Siddim Valley by 5 Mesopotamian kings. At Genesis 14, verses 11 through 12, we learn that the raiders took all the goods of Sodom and Gomorrah and all their food supply, and also Abram's nephew Lot and his possessions, and then they departed northward. Mention of Sodom's food supply is notable because elsewhere in the Bible, the produce of that area is quite renowned. At Genesis 13 verse 10, for example, Lot saw that the land of the lower Jordan near Sodom was lush like the land of Egypt, or like the garden of the Lord, which probably meant the Tigris-Euphrates plain where Lot used to live. So in biblical parlance, the vicinity of Sodom was a highly productive land. And Sodom itself was a city not just infamous in the Bible for its gross wickedness, but also noted for its abundant food at Ezekiel 16 verse 49, and for its wine at Genesis 19 verse 32, wine which Lot and his daughters must have taken with them out of Sodom when they finally fled from that city some years later. Back at Genesis 14, the military raid on Sodom by 5 Mesopotamian kings had no sooner been accomplished than we read in verses 13 through 15 that as soon as Abram heard about the invasion and knew his nephew was captured, he mustered his army to give chase. With his trained men born in his household, and evidently his 3 Amorite allies as well, he ambushed, that is, Abraham and his party ambushed the Mesopotamian invaders at northern Canaan, and then defeated them and even pursued them further north into Syria. After his victory, Abram began the march back to his camp in southern Canaan. At verse 16 we read that he brought back all the goods as well as his relative Lot with his possessions, and also the women and the people. So Abram was at the head of a large entourage, his 318 soldiers, his 3 allies with their fighting men as well presumably, plus many liberated captives, including Lot and his household. Verse 16 states that Abram brought women and people back with him, even though no previous verses mentioned them among the plunder. Similarly, verse 16 does not mention Abram returning with any food plundered from Sodom and Gomorrah, but other verses do imply that some of that food must have been brought back with Abram. Abram's southward journey was along the hill country of Canaan, and at verse 17 he reached 2 sites located close together along that highway, namely Salem, the ancient fortress we know today as Jerusalem, and also the King's Valley, the ground outside Jerusalem mentioned in David's day at 2 Samuel 18 verse 18, which is now generally identified as the site where Kidron and Hinnom valleys plus the ancient Tyropoeon Valley all converged about 200 meters southeast of the city. Abram's entourage would have congregated there around what was the only continuous year-round supply of living water, which is known as the En Rogel spring. Now, at verse 17, we read that the king of Sodom went out to meet Abram at the valley of Shaveh, or the King's Valley. It is unclear if this king of Sodom is the one named Bera at verse 2, for verse 10 strongly implies that he had died there, in which case the king of Sodom who met Abram must be Bera's successor, maybe his heir, his son perhaps. Whoever he was, I can call him Bera for convenience sake, and note that the record of him going to meet Abram comes just before Melchizedek appears, and picks up again straight after Abram's communion with Melchizedek at verses 18 and 21. And this indicates that Bera and Abram remained in close proximity all that time. Bera and Melchizedek had clearly both come out of Salem to the King's Valley to meet Abram. But whereas Bera appears to have come out merely for what he could get, in particular all the recovered goods originally plundered from Sodom, Melchizedek came with what he could give in the form of food and drink for the victorious army and the freed hostages. Details of Abram and Melchizedek's fellowship are kept to a minimum in verses 18 through 20, and many Bible commentators believe that the meal they shared was itself kept to a bare minimum. But the writer of Hebrews 7, whom I happen to believe to have been the Apostle Paul, was inspired to discuss Melchizedek's contact with Abram, and that discussion helped show that their fellowship was not a small or private affair. The focus throughout Paul's discussion is allegorical or typological, whereas my focus is on the literal fact of an actual fellowship meal outside Salem, upon which Paul's discussion was based. In his first few sentences of Hebrews 7, Paul twice refers to the tithes Abram gave. Verse 2 says he apportioned a tenth part of all. He apportioned a tenth part of all. And verse 4 of Hebrews 7 says that he gave a tenth of the choicest spoils. So in Paul's words, Abram apportioned a tenth part of all the choicest spoils. Throughout the Bible, spoils can refer to all manner of war booty, from clothes and trinkets, to weapons and armour, to livestock and slaves. But at verse 4 in Hebrews 7, Paul uniquely chose to render Abram's spoils by a word notably different from others in the New Testament that refer to the plunder of wealth or property or household vessels or utensils, weapons, armour, or human captives. No, Paul's word in the singular literally means the top of the heap, or what we might call the cream of the crop. In the plural, the word Paul used translates as first fruits. And in the classical Greco-Roman literature of Paul's day, it referred to the best produce, either from one's own crops or from crops raided during battle, which was traditionally offered in thanksgiving by the Greeks to their gods. So Paul apparently understood Abram's tithe to have comprised the best of the edible produce which Abram had among his own war booty, certainly food, but possibly drink as well. At least some of this produce will have been from Sodom and Gomorrah's food supply, which was taken by the invaders at Genesis 14:11, but retrieved by Abram and then carried back with him on his homeward march. By the time Abram reached Salem, some of that food and drink may have already been consumed along the way, but the very best of it remained, and that was what Abram chose to give Melchizedek. If we ask why I presume that the best remained, I would suggest that Abram would choose to give the very best to God in any case, by whatever means. Thus, Melchizedek comes out with bread and wine at Genesis 14 to initiate a meal. Then Abram contributes to the meal when he gives a tenth of all his war booty to Melchizedek at verse 20. The final meal will have included most or all of the produce originally plundered from Sodom, including grain and casks of wine. It is on the basis of this understanding of Abram's tithe that Paul can next draw a comparison between that tithe and the tithe under the law, of which we read in Hebrews 7, the tithe under the law which Brother John referred to this morning. Well, at Hebrews 7 verses 5 through 9, the tithe Melchizedek received from Abram is compared with tithes the Levite priesthood was meant to receive from their brethren. Paul says at verse 5 that they who inherit the priesthood from among the sons of Levi have a commandment to take tithes from the people according to the law, that is, from their brethren. Paul's mention of a command according to the law is a reference to Numbers 18. That chapter shows that the brethren Paul mentions in Hebrews were all those Levites who were not priests, as they were not sons of Aaron. As God explained to Aaron at Numbers 18 verses 1 to 6, he gave these Levites the vital role of serving or ministering to the priests, and he expressly referred to these Levite ministers as the priests' brethren. To the people of Israel, God repeatedly gave a command to tithe all the produce of the land which came from their fields. According to Deuteronomy 14 verses 22 through 26, as well as chapter 12 verses 17 through 18, this was to be done year by year, that is, each and every year. This tithe was to be eaten at the place of worship and included grain, new wine, oil, the firstborn of the herd or the flock, which may be exchanged by value for oxen, sheep, wine, strong drink, or whatever the worshipper desired. The Israelite worshippers with their households were to dine upon this food and drink as they rejoiced before the Lord at his appointed venue. Besides yearly tithes, there had to be triennial tithes as well, that is, a tithe every third year in addition to the normal yearly tithe. These triennial tithes in Deuteronomy 14 verses 28 through 29 and Deuteronomy 26 were placed in the Israelites' town gates as a gift for widows, orphans and foreigners who lived there, but they were also a gift for the Levites who lived in the vicinity, that is to say, the Levites who were not priests. This was essential for the Levite ministers because they needed the tithe for their sustenance. Without them, they could starve. And for this reason, Israel's obligation to tithe their food is directly linked to God's command to Israel at Deuteronomy chapter 12 verse 19 and chapter 14 verse 27, God's command to not neglect the Levites. Unfortunately, this is exactly what they did, as seen especially in the Old Testament book of Judges. Obviously, no Levite would survive for long on foods tithed only once a year, let alone once every 3 years. So coming back now to Numbers 18, we learn of God's arrangement whereby Levite ministers and priests would take tithes on a year-round and more or less daily basis. These tithes came out of the numerous heave offerings referred to throughout Numbers 18, which the Israelites contributed in the form of their grain offerings, their sin offerings, their guilt offerings, their wave offerings, as well as holy gifts and their firstborn oxen, sheep and goats. We learn at verses 8 through 20 in that chapter that these heave offerings were given by God as a portion or allocation of food and drink to the priests. Part was to be eaten only by the priests and their sons, as verse 10 says, while much of it was given by God to their whole family to consume, as verses 11 and 19 say. As Paul pointed out, though, the priest's portion came via their Levite brethren, which is what Numbers 18 goes on to describe. At Numbers 18 verses 21 and 24, God says, "In return for the service that they perform, I have given all the tithe of Israel for an inheritance to the sons of Levi. I have given to the Levites as their inheritance the tithe from the sons of Israel, which they offer as a heave offering to the Lord." So here, the sons of Levi are the ministering brethren who serve the priests. And we learn here that the tithes of which Paul wrote were the heave offerings. From verses 25 to 32, God explains to Moses that when the Levite ministers take their tithe from the Israelites, they must take a tithe out of that tithe and present it as their heave offering to the Lord, then give it to the priest as the Lord's heave offering. This illustrates what Paul said at Hebrews 7 verse 5 and shows that the tithes which the priests took from the brethren were the heave offerings to which God entrusted Aaron earlier in Numbers 18. It was from the hands of their ministering Levite brethren that the Aaronic priests took their God-given food allocation in exactly the same way that it was from the hands of the Israelite tribes that the Levite ministers took their own food allocation. So the Levites over here were taking their allocation from the other Israelite tribes, and over here the Aaronic priests, who of course were of the tribe of Levi but were priests, they were taking their contribution from the other Levites, who were simply ministers and not priests. So what the high priest and his sons took for themselves was not a tenth of the entire national offering given by all Israel. As Numbers 18 verse 26 says, it was a tithe of the tithe, which is to say 1/10 of 1/10. So just 1% of what the other tribes gave in total. But Paul could truly call the priest's allocation a tithe because it was always a tenth or a tithe of the Levite minister's full allocation. The 9/10 that remained in the hands of the Levite ministers was fair and proportionate to their population size, for they outnumbered the Aaronic priests by about the same order of magnitude. As tithe portions were passed up the line from lay Israelites to the Levite ministers, to the Aaronic priests, and finally to the high priest, they reduced in quantity but also increased in quality until the priests and ultimately the high priest partook of the very best portions of all the produce of the land. As God told high priest Aaron at Numbers 18 verses 12 through 13, all the best of the fresh oil and all the best of the fresh wine and of the grain, the first fruits of those which they give to the Lord, I give them to you. The first ripe fruits of all that is in their land, which they bring to the Lord, shall be yours. And so also Abram gave his tithe from the best of his spoils to the priest Melchizedek. Paul mentions that the priests have commandment according to the law to collect a tithe. By contrast, Abram was not under any such law. He was not commanded to give. Instead, he gave of his best by choice and by his own initiative. It had been Abram's food, won in fair fight, but he gave it away so it could be available in the service of fellowship under the headship of God's king priest. And so all who had gathered at the King's Valley that day also shared in the king's table, thanks in part to Abram's tithe. And recall that this gathering included Lot and Bera. As to why a king of Sodom was at Salem in the first place, this is surely because he was one of those refugees whom verse 10 says survived the attack in Siddim Valley and fled into the hills. He must have then sought and obtained refuge with Melchizedek in his fortress city. Thus we are presented here with a king of peace and righteousness and a priest of the Most High God who was evidently providing hospitable safe haven to one of the Sodomites, a people described in Genesis 13 verse 13 as wicked and sinners against the Lord exceedingly. Melchizedek was clearly a man of similar character to Messiah himself, whose own mission it is to invite and welcome sinners into his presence that they may be saved. It was this Christ-like spirit that also motivated Abram to save his relative Lot, even though he too was a citizen of Sodom. And in that same spirit, Abram offered safety to many other Sodomites who had been taken captive by their common enemy. So while our record of Melchizedek and Abram's meeting is a picture of a godly gathering, the presence among them of other people, including Sodomites like Bera and Lot, make it also a depiction of saving grace on offer to sinners at that same fellowship event. For Lot especially, reconnection with Abram and then his contact with the king priest of Salem presented Lot with a God-given opportunity to consider his ways and repent of his evil decision to dwell in Sodom. We know, however, that although Lot's choice of Sodom was almost his downfall, even then because of the invasion by the Mesopotamian kings, he nevertheless chose to go back there. And years later, at Genesis 18 this time, Abram, or Abraham as he was by then, again sought to save Lot and his people from Sodom's final destruction. The intercession Abraham made by appealing to God's mercy showed the same hope and compassion toward Lot that he showed in the fellowship event at Genesis 14. In a series of talks presented some years ago, we considered several of God's precepts and institutions which may be understood to have originally been revealed to mankind extremely early in biblical history, even so early as the Garden of Eden. And this early revelation of those precepts and institutions is apparently true despite the fact that their first clear mention actually appears later in the record. Among those precepts and institutions was the slaying of animals to shed their blood for remission of sins. For example, just because Genesis 3 verse 21 says God clothed Adam and Eve in animal skin garments, we might reasonably infer that at that time, even before they were expelled from the garden, recall, God had taught them first principles of the shed blood essential for their atonement and salvation, principles not described until much further on in Scripture. Similarly then, the story of Cain and Abel at Genesis 4 shows that Adam and Eve had passed on to their family principles of a holy place and an altar, as well as blood sacrifice and burnt offerings, all of which precepts and institutions were originally taught them by God himself. And again, these conclusions, while not entirely obvious from Genesis 4 itself, are reasonable deductions from more explicit information recorded considerably later in the Scripture record. In the same way, we can also deduce that a principle of God's which required mankind to make distinction between clean animals and unclean animals was certainly revealed much earlier than its first explicit mention, and most probably even as early as Adam in Eden. But not until Genesis 7 verse 2 in the record of the flood, which was about 1656 years after Eden, does Scripture suddenly mention for the first time that animals were classed as either clean or unclean. And yet, although this mention apparently comes out of nowhere, as far as a reader can ascertain from the earlier Bible record, Noah was clearly already aware of clean and unclean animals, just as we know that he was aware of altars. So he must have been aware of clean and unclean animals so as to make the correct distinctions between them before the flood, and so as to offer valid burnt offerings upon his altar after the flood at Genesis 8 verses 20 through 21. Now, because Noah knew about altars and burnt offerings from animal sacrifices, which all dated back to Adam's day, it is reasonable to conclude that through all the generations down which knowledge of those precepts and institutions were passed on to Noah, it must have included the distinction between clean and unclean animals, in which case that principle dated back to Adam's day also. This is a conclusion which is actually granted by most Bible scholars that I've had access to. In Noah's story, those clean animals are described merely as animals and birds, or as you might say, beasts and birds. It is not until further on again in the Bible record that clean animals are identified by their particular species. This was about 4.5 centuries after the flood, when Abram had been in the land of Canaan for almost 10 years, and he was instructed by God at Genesis 15 verse 9 to bring to God 5 specific animals, both beasts and birds. These represented 5 species, namely the ox, the goat, the sheep, the turtle dove, and the pigeon. Yet another 4 centuries later again, these 5 species would prove to be the exact same that God prescribed for blood offerings under the law of Moses. these 5 are unique in being the only species Israel was permitted to use for such sacrifices. They alone had to be used exclusively, even though in the same law of Moses, God did pronounce that many other species were clean or kosher for human consumption, and that in certain different circumstances, it was in fact a very different beast that God required to be slain. But their slaying was not for remission of sins. It is therefore highly unlikely that the ox, goat, sheep, turtle dove and pigeon were species which God just suddenly decided upon only in Moses or Abraham's lifetimes, or even indeed in Noah's lifetime. I think it is more than probable that these 5 are the very species which God had prescribed from the beginning when he first instituted animal sacrifices in Adam's day. Now, while this postulate is a back inference and cannot be proved absolutely or decisively, not in the same way a chemical formula or mathematical equation can be proven, it does align with the explicit record in early Genesis, and it lends a certain strong harmony and strong consistency to those precepts and institutions of God which appear later in the Old Testament. For example, the presumption that those 5 clean animals were originally instituted in Adam's day lends harmony and consistency to the accounts of shed blood and offerings at Genesis chapters 3 and 4. So at Genesis 4 verse 4, Abel was a keeper of flocks, or more literally little cattle, and so it was from his flock that he brought an offering which was acceptable to God. And it was in like manner that the Israelites could bring an acceptable offering of a sheep or goat to the Mosaic altar many centuries later. Going back earlier than Abel to Genesis 3 verse 21, the garments of skin with which God clothed Adam and his wife can reasonably be supposed to have come from the carcass of one of the 3 clean beasts of the herd or from the flock. And so it can be no coincidence that under the Mosaic law, as Leviticus 7 verse 8 states, the priest shall have the skin of the burnt offering for himself. While the precise details might not exactly coincide or might not be readily detected, I think it does appear that the Levitical command to bestow the skin of a burnt offering on the priest has a connection in some way with the original skin bestowed upon Adam and Eve. The book of Job we don't often think of as a book concerning sacrifice. Anyway, it begins in chapter 1 with its famous character reference of Job, a man of exemplary godliness and integrity. It then proceeds immediately in verses 2 through 3 to list Job's material blessings, concluding that he was the greatest of all the men of the East. This list is mostly a tally of Job's livestock, and it is surprisingly detailed. It was left on record under inspiration, and it was left on record obviously for our information, and it will later prove to be of more than just academic interest. But topmost in the inspired list of Job's blessings are his 7 sons and 3 daughters, who are presented as major characters in chapter 1, featuring in fully a third of the early narrative that sets the stage for Job's trial of faith. At this phase of Job's life, here in chapter 1, no mention is made of his parents or of any grandchildren, so Job's family appears to number 2 generations only. When Satan received God's authorization to strike Job with the evils which befell him that first awful day, Job's sons were by then all adults, for each of the 7 was living in his own house. I'm not suggesting what age they were necessarily, but they were obviously of an age to take responsibility for their own homes. Now, assuming that Job had no grandchildren at this time, then his own children were probably just young adults and not yet married, in which case his daughters were still living under Job's roof, presumably. Each of Job's sons would take a turn at hosting a dinner in his own home, where all 10 siblings would dine and drink wine together, as recorded in Job chapter 1, verses 4, verse 5, verse 13, and verse 18. Now, Darby's and Rotherham's Bibles and the New Revised Standard Version, reputable Bibles for the accuracy of their translations, they translate verse 4 to say that each dinner was prepared not only by the brother in whose house it was held, but by all 7 collectively. So it wasn't just a one-man job. So these 7 brethren depict a generous, hospitable and cooperative brotherhood. In their fraternal dinners, we again see service and participation around a fellowship meal. We might even see in this record of Job's children some evidence of the affectionate, companionable and united relationships among them that may speak well of God's influence in their lives. The Hebrew word for these dinners means drinks or drinking. Thus it also denotes meals that specifically incorporate wine or beverages. In the other books, Ezra 3 verse 7 and Daniel 1 verse 5, the same word meaning drinks or drinking, it refers to daily meals of basic provisions or a staple diet. Several other Old Testament references apply to occasional meals, particularly those for social or celebratory gatherings, such as Lot's evening dinner for visitors to Sodom at Genesis 19 verse 3, also Isaac's covenant meal with his neighbours at Genesis 26 verse 30, also Jacob's wedding breakfast or Samson's stag party at Genesis 29 verse 22 and Judges 14 verse 10 respectively. It also refers to David's conference lunch at 2 Samuel 3 verse 20 and to the Persian banquets in the book of Esther, and ultimately to the Messianic supper in God's kingdom, referred to at Isaiah 25 verse 6. So these are references to the same word that is used of the meals that Job's sons prepared and shared with their siblings. Now all this wining and dining might be rendered by the word banquet, except that strictly speaking this word describes a much more sumptuous or lavish meal than what the Hebrew word essentially means. This distinction can be seen in 1 Samuel 25 verse 36, which says that Nabal held a dinner like the dinner of a king. His dinner was notably larger and grander, in other words more sumptuous or lavish than was normal or usual for the common man. To underline how intimate was the association of fellowship with food in Job's family, we find that just as this subject bookends the entire Bible, so it bookends the inspired book of Job. Dinners held by Job's children in their homes before his trial of faith in chapter 1 are matched or paralleled by the meal or meals held by Job in his own house with his own brothers and sisters and acquaintances after his trial at chapter 42 verse 11. All these occasions of food and fellowship probably looked much like the extended family meals which are still very normal in traditional Mediterranean and Levantine households to this day. Now for Job's children, the time always arrived after an unspecified period when the days of dining had, as chapter 1 verse 5 puts it, completed their cycle or gone about or come around. So it's saying that when the days of dining had gone around or completed their cycle, that's at chapter 1 verse 5. Another similar passage is in Isaiah 29 verse 1, which says, "Let your feasts run their round," or let the feasts come around. This refers to the yearly cycle of Israel's sacred festivals, and more specifically to the time when one annual cycle ended and the next one began, probably at Passover time, but it depends on the calendar scheme that Isaiah was alluding to. Similarly then, Job's children's cycle of dinners must have been held periodically and repeatedly on a regular schedule, with distinct days of commencement and conclusion. The cyclical character of these dinners does not mean that they were sacrifices or feasts like those in Israel, but it may imply that they were sacred appointments, just as all of Israel's feasts and convocations were. Job 1 verse 5 goes on to explain that once one round of dinners had concluded and another round was about to begin, that occasion was marked by Job and his children at an altar, when he would summon and consecrate them, rising early in the morning and offering burnt offerings by number for them all. This indicates that all the meetings, those at Job's altar as well as at his sons' homes, they all followed the same cycle. They were part of the same periodic routine which every participant participated in. This reflects that the dinners of Job's children were held with his knowledge and with his sanction. He knew their dinner roster, he knew the day a cycle would run its course, and he knew that the morning following was his time to summon his sons to the altar. This was customary procedure for Job, showing that he followed a systematic, coordinated, and ongoing schedule in the same event calendar which his sons observed. As head of his household, Job was high priest to his whole family. Every time they met at the altar, he would lead them in worship and offer a burnt offering for each of his children, though whether for all 10 or just for his sons, I'm not sure about that. Job's service was similar to that from Adam's day when God first revealed the essentials of blood sacrifice, and it was similar to that since Moses' day when God gave his law to Israel. With Job chapter 42, verses 8 through 9 in one hand, and Leviticus chapter 1, verse 3 through 5 open in the other hand, they can be guides, and it may be inferred from these two that in Job chapter 1, verse 5, the burnt offerings were provided by Job's sons. Each son brought a male animal without defect from his own herd or flock, and then personally he slew the animal that it might be accepted in his stead to make atonement for him on his behalf. Job's function was to take the carcass and offer it to God on the altar fire. This was so each son, as we read in Leviticus chapter 1 verse 3, may be accepted before the Lord. And this presumably was the means by which Job consecrated his sons, as Job chapter 1 verse 5 says. And this, we read, Job did continually. Now, in their respective role as priest and offerers, Job and his sons participated together in a collaborative and coordinated act of service and worship. For Job's role in these proceedings to be efficacious, it required of his sons that their own role be performed in a manner also acceptable before God. So the fact that they were consecrated continually, I believe, must reflect how acceptably that the sons did conduct themselves. We may imagine that on each occasion at the altar, their contribution and their participation was as wholehearted and showed the same diligent sacrificial spirit as when they served at their fraternal dinners. Now, a popular theory is that the dinners were simply birthday celebrations for the 7 sons, which implies they were held about 7 weeks apart on average, so that they would fall each once a year. It also means that the burnt offerings were no more than an annual event. Alternatively, because every cycle had 7 home meetings, each on its own day, it is surely not unreasonable, I think, to surmise that each cycle took just exactly that, 7 days, so that the offerings were weekly, maybe even sabbatical, and the dinners were literally daily. This is not impossible, of course. It is certainly plausible, for it sounds strikingly similar to meetings of the earliest Jewish Christians as described at Acts chapter 2 verse 46, which reads, "Day by day, continuing with one mind in the temple and breaking bread from house to house, they were taking their meals together with gladness and sincerity of heart." So it may yet be that Job's children likewise had met daily for spiritual fellowship meals at alternate homes through the week. Because the record is not explicit about the motive or purpose behind the dinners, scholars offer a range of interpretations, from either pleasant, dignified receptions which blessed Job's heart, to self-indulgent amusements at which the young adults felt free of their pious old man's critical gaze or hard words. Some commentators suggest the dinners were drunken affairs, such as some Israelites were guilty of despite having godly fathers, in which case the tragic end of one such dinner is held up as evidence that all 10 children had been ripe for God's judgment and that the dinners were a prime example of their worldliness, raising the charge that such meals are themselves worldly. But in the whole Bible, criticism of Job's children appears to have come only from Eliphaz the Temanite at Job 4 verses 7 through 9 and verses 17 through 21, and then from Bildad the Shuhite at chapter 8 verses 1 through 4. Those two men, Eliphaz and Bildad, they seemed to have judged that Job's children were sinful or would have been spared their violent deaths. But these critics were two men of whom God later said at chapter 42 verse 7, "You have not spoken of me what is right." Job himself did say at Job chapter 1 verse 5, "Perhaps my children have sinned and cursed God in their hearts." Yet his use of that word perhaps or maybe simply indicates that whatever the sins under consideration, in Job's mind they were simply a possibility, not a certainty. So Job did not judge his children's dinners to be intrinsically sinful, otherwise he would have immediately attributed their sin to those dinners. After the children had died by the power of God vested in Satan, God said at chapter 2 verse 3 that he was moved against Job without any cause, which by itself strongly implies that prior to Job's test, there was no sin in his own children which God considered suitable grounds to condemn them to death. Due to chapter 1's focus on Job's children, precisely because they were Job's children, that record need not have mentioned other guests at their dinners, yet we can tell that others did sometimes attend, for in verses 18 through 19 of chapter 1, the news of a house collapse that killed all 10 children was given to Job by a messenger who described himself as the sole survivor to have escaped that calamity, which indicates that he was on the premises at the time, maybe even had been right in there in the dining area. For any parent, of course, however faithful and godly, the death of one's own child is a grievous blow and a cause of huge emotional trauma that some bereaved parents never recover from. Loving father that he was, surely the worst evil inflicted on Job was not the loss of his livestock and other chattels, but it was the violent and untimely deaths of his 10 children. The ache of their absence will have been felt by he and his wife long after his trial of faith was over. But at the end of that tunnel was a light which God foresaw and which Job also foresaw, I believe. We glimpse it in the last chapter of Job's story. After Job's trials ended, a new phase of life began in which, as Job 42 verse 10 says, the Lord gave Job twice as much as he had before. Now this doubling of Job's fortunes did not happen immediately or swiftly, but gradually in stages through the rest of his life. At verse 12, for example, his later stock numbers are enumerated so they can be compared with those earlier numbers of chapter 1 verses 14 through 17. And the comparison shows that ultimately Job acquired exactly twice as many livestock as he used to have. Although less explicit, verse 16 also reveals this twofold increase by saying that before he died, Job and his new offspring eventually numbered 4 generations, twice as many as in chapter 1. These examples in verses 12 through 16 of the last chapter of Job show clearly, simply, and obviously how God gave Job double of what he once had. The example at verse 13, though, is not so straightforward. It says that Job again fathered 7 sons and 3 daughters, the identical number that he had lost. So Job ended his days, the day of his death, not with twice as many children, but only as many as he began with in chapter 1. And nevertheless, this final figure is on record, I believe, to illustrate that in numbers of children, Job was indeed blessed with a twofold increase. And this seeming anomaly is possible, I believe, of only one explanation. Job's last 10 children count as twice the original number, only if their number gets added to the 10 who had died. Now, if I had 10 fingers in this hand and this 10 in this hand, I could put them together and show you what I mean. In other words, Job's last 10 children are an addition to the first 10. Obviously, by the time all of Job's last 10 children were born, his first 10 were all long dead. And therefore, to bring the sum total of children up to the 20 needed to indicate a twofold increase, the first 10 are counted as if they are no longer dead. They are reckoned as alive again, alongside the living. Job 42 verse 13, which leads to this conclusion, was of course inspired by the same God who, as Romans 4 verse 17 says, gives life to the dead and calls those that be not as though they were. And for Job's part, he could also imagine that his 10 dead children were actually alive if he, like Abraham, as we read at Hebrews 11 verse 19, considered that God is able to raise people even from the dead. In fact, Job said as much at Job 19 verses 25 through 27 and at chapter 14 verses 13 through 15. To awake from death and live again was his blessed hope, which rested on faith that even after his body had been consumed in the ground, he would again, in his flesh, one day see his Redeemer. Job's expectation of eternal life depended on resurrection, the same hope which he had no doubt held for his children and taught them all to embrace. We cannot imagine that Job, as righteous as he was, did not teach his children his own faith. And of course he did, and taught them what he believed about life after death. But the resurrection will be a blessing only to the righteous. There will be some on that day who will instead awake to shame and everlasting contempt, as Daniel 12 verse 2 says. So the implication regarding Job's children is clear. By faith, Job must have been assured that God judged his dead children worthy to attain to that age and the resurrection of the redeemed. At least that was his optimistic estimation. His hope then was to awake from the dust of the ground to everlasting life and to see on that day all 20 of his children raised alongside him, 14 sons and 6 daughters entering together with their father into the joy of their Lord. So Job 42 verse 13 hints, all implicitly and inferentially, at Job's belief in his double blessing of children being ultimately realized in God's eternal kingdom. So in its last chapter, Job's story becomes an account of the justification of Job, but also, I believe, vindication that his children, whose lives were cut short so horribly and at the time so inexplicably, are not as the beasts that perish, but are alive to God in the same way that Abraham, Isaac and Jacob, who lie at rest in their graves, asleep in the dust of the ground, and await the day of their promised reward. They, Abraham, Isaac and Jacob, are alive to God even though they are dead at present. And so I believe it is true of Job's children. They will prove to be among those in Malachi 3 verse 16 who feared the Lord, esteemed his name, spoke to one another often, of whom God says they will be mine, and for whom a book of remembrance has been written. Thus the account of Job's children in chapter 1 is illustrative of God's earliest design for spiritual communion. To their dying day, they did not forsake the assembling of themselves together, but regularly shared one another's godly company at meals centered around sacrifice. So it is inspiring to think that at their resurrection, the next thing they will know is Messiah's welcome to his own marriage supper, where, with Job and one another and all the saints, they will once again enjoy God's sacred appointment of food and fellowship. Now, it is arguable what period of history Job lived in, and there are a few good, interesting theories, but it is appropriate, I think, that it remains uncertain, because the lessons from Job's experience are actually timeless. They speak to questions that people in every era, in every generation, and in every century can relate to. Food and fellowship's inclusion in the account is therefore inspired testimony to its timeless universal relevance. And there I will close.